Welcome to my presentation. So, due to the format on the sign-up sheet, I thought I signed up for contemporary realistic fiction, and then I received the email from Sister Flory saying that it was controversial literature, and I will begin by apologizing. That was not my intent, and because I'm rather heated on the subject. So, um, I am not a proponent of book burning or book banning, nor am I a proponent of the anti-bias movement that is invading our school system. I feel it is a personal responsibility both to preserve our freedom by not burning books or banning books, but more importantly, to censor our reading. The family is the central unit of society, and the decision to ban certain literature should happen at the individual, family, maybe organizational, and at the largest, the local community level based upon the values and morals of the individuals involved, not from some agenda or organization of individuals whose mission is to control the minds of the masses. So I have a mind shift proposal for you to consider. One, everyone has a bias. There's no such thing as anti-bias, because if you have any type of standard or any type of preference or any type of opinion, you have a bias. The second is the idea proposal is that the anti-bias fast is becoming the new religion or a substitute for our standard of moral lives that's dictated by society, because its platform incorporates such truths such as integrating everybody and kindness. It's hard to see that it's also anti-truth or differently biased, such as accepting different definitions of family and gender different than what God intended. Okay, so for my first attempt, not to delve too deeply into what I don't like about the controversial books, I chose one that I am a proponent of. And this is a religious-based book. It's called The Giant Killer. It was written by Charlotte Marie Tucker. Now, interesting note, Charlotte was born in England, daughter of Henry Tucker, and he was the chairman of the East India Company. He was against girls going to school and discouraged his children from writing. So, even though she loved learning and she loved writing, she waited until after his death before anything was published. And even then, she was published under the pseudonym ALOE, which stands for A Lady of England. She was full of energy and very generous. She had talents in music, drawing, writing, acting, and teaching. She was a deep thinker and was always religious. She dedicated her life to teaching and writing instructional stories for children, and she spent the last 18 years of her life serving and teaching the people of India. So, the book was first published by Nelson and Sons in 1873 and has been republished through Lamplighter Publishers in 2004. Although the language and the setting of the story may be difficult for younger children to grasp, the adventures that take place can be visualized by some as young as 5 years old, and many adults find enjoyment and understanding from the allegorical story. Okay, so that brings us to the fact that it is an allegory. First of all, it's a lot like The Princess Bride, where a story is being read to someone in the modern time and it takes them back to a fantasy. This story takes place in England at the time that it was published, so it was a modern realistic story when it was written. So 2 young boys have a history of being very nasty, naughty, and are sent to live with the vicar to be educated along with his children. During the intercourse of their stay, the mother regularly reads a fantasy to the children called The Giant Killer. The story was specifically chosen for the sake of the unruly boys and has surprisingly had unexpected application for the dutiful and virtuous son and 2 daughters as well. The story is allegorical, meaning that it holds a double or a hidden meaning, and it's didactical, meaning that it was intended to apply to the listener and instruct them in a moral lesson. So it takes place, or in the fantasy world, it is Sir Fides, or representing fidelity, is the noble knight who represents all of us as we face and fight the giants of the character flaws in our lives. Through the guidance of conscience and using the mighty sword, he breaks through the web of sloth, struggle out of the pit of selfishness, place pleasure under its rightful place beneath benevolence, and flee the secret lurking places of untruth. We will choke up the fount of anger and triumph over our most malicious enemy, giant pride. Although the real story takes place is a historical fiction genre, at the time that it was made, it was a contemporary modern literature. And the allegory is a fantasy, and so I'm evaluating it based on the fantasy criteria. I thought this was a fun visual. Obviously, there's an audio version out there. The first criteria is consistency. Since there are two stories taking place, I need to evaluate the consistency between both of those worlds. The real world is charming and quaint, with the little family more wise and obedient than is typically witnessed in our current world. Some might say that it's too perfect, but enough stories have been told at that time period to suspect the author as being too idealistic. The fantasy world is of knights and giants and is consistent to the medieval visions of quest, courage, and the insurmountable odds. Although it's not a problem, there is the fact that the fantasy world is an allegory of character flaws in our world, both in the story and for the reader. And so there seems to be a going back and forth between consistency in the fictitious storyline and the application to the reader. As you see the attributes of giant sloth in your own unfinished projects, or recognize the rope of love is what allows one to escape the pit of created by giant selfishness. It's an interesting and convoluted consistency. Suspend disbelief. It's obvious that the story is an allegory, even to the children in the story. The characters begin in the real world. However, they only hear about the fantasy world in the form of a story. The world of Sir Fides isn't so much believable as a real place and happenings, but as a real depiction of how those evils weaken and fight against our more noble ambitions. In both the historical and the fanciful world, the language is appropriate and consistent. Detail. The details about the world of giants develops over time, although may be confusing due to the double meaning as it relates to the details in our own lives. The use of language and the moral expectations give the majority of the detailed setting and the time period rather than the description of the environment. Theme. The theme is pretty obvious of good conquering evil and our part in making that happen. It's a great theme for children to visualize themselves as the hero who fights off the evil tendencies of their fallen nature. It's a lifelong adventure and responsibility that is best learned while during the developing stages of life. And lastly is the point of view. The point of view in both the real world and the fantasy world effectively immerse the reader in both understanding and believing the environmental happenings. The reader, meaning me, could feel the transition from my world to 19th century Victorian style vicarage, and then again transitioning to the medieval quest, using a valiant sword and armor to fight against the defined evils before him, or before me. And that is my presentation.